So what I want to do is talk just a couple minutes about the European Union. Okay, what is the European Union? The European Union actually has kind of an interesting history. It started off as the European. Before it was the European Union, the form that we know today. It started out as Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg, and they agreed to pool these coal and steel resources in Saarland, which is kind of on the border of France and Germany. And the idea was that by pooling coal and steel resources together after World War II, this might prevent these countries from having militaries that could mobilize and start another world war. So it was actually in the interest of reducing war. Now, over time, the European Union has grown into something very, very different. What you wind up having is a trading bloc that is the biggest economic trading bloc in the world. Bigger than the U.S., bigger than China, take your pick. You have free movement of people, goods, and services within the European Union. What does that mean? It means you can drive from France to Germany. You will not be asked for your passport. You will not be asked for a visa. If you're French, you can buy land in Germany and you can live there. You can take a job in Germany. You can go anywhere you want and you won't be asked any questions because you are a citizen of the European Union. That's what takes precedence. I did have one exception to that. For some reason, I was asked to show my passport on a train to Spain, but I never did figure out why that was. And I was coming from France. I can never figure that one out. There's a common currency, the euro, and this is very important for promoting trade. Back in the old days, before the euro came along, let's say you were in France and you wanted to go to Belgium. Well, you had to go through a currency exchange and the traveler's checks, and it was a nightmare. And there were so many currencies. Now you've got one currency. Okay? So again, if it's 3 euros in France, is also 3 euros in Germany, Italy, take your pick. Okay? Then there's some other things. Of course, they cooperate on matters of justice. They're working on things like common diplomacy. That's a work in progress. And an interesting part of globalization is a project founded by the European Commission called Erasmus. And Erasmus is basically, you are a university student, you can go to a partner school in pretty much anywhere in the European Union as far as I know. And if there's a difference in the tuition cost between your host university and the university where you're going on exchange, the European Commission, I believe, still foots the difference, which is really great. I know that when I was in graduate school in France, we had a lot of people coming from poorer countries in the European Union, and the European Commission footed the bill, and this was great because the French students got to meet people from all over the European Union. One of my colleagues in graduate school was a guy from Italy. He did 2 years of Erasmus in Finland. He said, if he was ever Prime Minister of Italy, he'd never go to war with the Finnish people because he loves them just too much. He thinks they're great. And again, so this is promoting social globalization, cultural globalization, economic globalization, justice globalization. It's actually very interesting. Those of you that are sitting with me in the in-person class lectures, we'll talk a lot more about this during the lecture, but I at least kind of want to give you a taste of the European Union as an example of globalization. So let's talk a little bit more about free trade. Why? Why even do that? Why even do free trade? Well, first of all, what is free trade? So free trade is the idea that, again, goods and services can flow across borders and there's not going to be a tax, a tariff, a quota, a restriction. None of it. Okay. Then there's also another reason, one of the main reasons for free trade is what we call the competitive advantage of nations. Okay. And competitive advantage. So basically, certain countries can become specialized in producing certain kinds of goods and or service, and it can give them an advantage over other countries. Okay, Um, you've probably seen this in your basic macroeconomics classes, I would assume. Let's see if I can draw it on here. Let me go with a slightly finer point here. The production possibilities frontier. Every country can produce guns or butter. It's an economic curve to show a trade-off between goods and services. So for every time I produce a few more guns, I produce a certain quantity less of butter. And this is an example of comparative advantage applied to the law of comparative advantage of nations. Let me give an example to kind of clarify what I'm saying. Okay, imagine you've got a country that produces a lot of oil, and you've got a country that produces a lot of rice. Okay, let's think of, and again, I'm not picking on any particular country. I'm just kind of giving some examples as they come to me. Think of Saudi Arabia. It doesn't rain very much in Saudi Arabia, but they can pretty much poke a stick in the ground and there'll be oil coming up. Okay? Look at a country where it rains a lot, like Vietnam. Okay, well, because it rains so much, that'd be a pretty good place to produce rice, but I don't know that if Vietnam has really all that much in terms of oil resources, at least not onshore oil resources. So what makes sense is for our friends in Saudi Arabia to pump oil out of the ground and then trade the oil to their friends in Vietnam for rice, and then they can go back and forth. It would be a lot of effort for the Saudis to grow rice paddies because they don't get enough rain, but not much effort for oil. Likewise, it's a lot of effort for our friends in Vietnam to try to hunt their country down for some oil, but they can trade the rice relatively easy. So if they trade the oil for rice, everybody's a winner. Okay? That's one of the arguments for free trade based on comparative advantage. Hopefully that helps. Now, there's also arguments for what is called protectionism. Protectionism is the opposite of free trade. Okay? Protectionism is the opposite. And that protectionism is basically using trade barriers and tariffs to protect domestic industries from foreign competitors. And why would you do that? Well, first of all, again, it might be because of a slight mercantilist bent that a trade barrier can help lower an unhealthy trade deficit, i.e. a country is importing too many goods and not exporting enough. Okay, so if you put up those tariffs, then you would import less and export more. Think of it, for example, because when you import so much, it's almost like putting things on a credit card or buying things that you don't have the money for. Okay, so this may be a way to reduce things like a deficit or the national debt level. That's one way. However, it can also be used at the macroeconomic level or the industrial policy level to help promote the growth of certain technologies, to protect certain countries, certain industry sectors. Let me give a few examples a little bit later. So again, why would you even use protectionism? Again, where you run into protectionism is also with unfair trade tactics. Furthermore, tariffs can also be used in terms of protectionism in countries that don't have a well-developed civil service or tax structure. Those tariffs on imports can be used to pay for civil servants and pay for governments. Yeah, so the tariffs of things coming in. So let me give an example that will kind of clarify all of this. I remember reading a story about France during the 1980s, and they were trying to develop a high-tech sector, a technology industry, but they couldn't, okay, because their friends in Japan were much better at producing technology, and they were able to export those goods very cheaply into the French market. The French simply could not compete. So what did they do? They wound up having temporarily, again, they didn't want to violate WTO rules, but they temporarily had a rule saying that any technology products that came in from Japan had to be tested to make sure that they were actually technology products and that they were safe for the French market. So you had ships coming in, right? Ships of things coming in from Japan. This is an example of unfair trade tactics. And what did they do? They had one customs inspector to inspect tens of thousands of goods. And of course, he was taking his time about it, I'm sure. And of course, this got people's attention very quickly. The dispute wound up getting resolved, to make a long story short. But again, that's an example. France wanted to promote their own domestic technology industry, even though the goods from Japan were being produced more competitively. Okay? So I'll give a couple more examples of that internationally in just a few minutes. Again, free traders are almost universally against protectionism. Again, because the argument is that for internationally, the overall benefit is that everyone is better off in the long run from free trade, which is true. Again, but politicians are elected on a short-run basis. In the U.S., we also have protectionism within our borders. Think of the Federal Buy American Act. That basically means that in federal acquisitions, you can pay up to 10% more. Although the legislation changed. I remember a few years ago it was 8, but I believe it's now 10. Up to 10% more for a U.S.-produced product versus a foreign-produced product. However, usually if the foreign good is cheaper, it's cheaper by much more than 10%. I know, for example, when I was in the Army and stationed in Korea, we always had the choice in acquisitions. Do we buy a locally Korean-produced product or do we buy stuff from an American company? And the Korean product was always cheaper, and it was always way cheaper than the 8% that we were allowed under the Federal Buy American Act. So we always bought locally produced Korean products. So the Federal Buy American Act didn't really help that much. You've also got the Merchant Marine Act that basically says that foreign vessels cannot be utilizing American-specific waterways, for example, like the Mississippi River. Seems kind of weird now, but you have to think about it historically. Imagine what a disaster it would be if a foreign navy wound up sailing up the Mississippi and bombarding our coast. So it does have a historical precedent. And then, of course, again, the Passenger Vessel Services Act. So if a ship is only going from one American port to another, it must be an American company doing it. It must be an American flagged vessel, and it must be an American crew doing so. So we have some protectionism here in the United States also. Now, foreign countries, and the U.S. also, have additional foreign protections. Think about aspects of protectionism, pardon me. Look at China. They have substantial barriers on imports. These include all sorts of infant industries that they'd like to protect. Watches, cars, steel, textiles, a lot of food products. Okay. In Japan, they do not accept U.S. imports of meat, poultry, vegetables, and fruit products. And that's also the same in the European Union. In Japan and the European Union, there's two reasons that you might have protectionism when it comes to food. One is that a lot of countries think our food products are dirty, particularly with genetically modified organisms. Additionally, farmers in every country, including the U.S., are a very powerful lobby. And most farming lobbying groups are not receptive to the importing or the competition from foreign farmers. And we have this same problem in the U.S. Our agricultural imports are actually quite restricted. And a third reason for agriculture also being protected by tariffs, again, a country that cannot feed itself cannot fight during a time of war. So we always want to make sure that we promote agriculture, and we typically do that through tariffs. So that about wraps us up here. So we discussed globalization. I hope you found this lecture interesting and informative. Again, my name is Duncan Pelly, and we'll see you next time.